Welcome to the Navigating the Rise application. This is a specific presentation for clinical applications only and for pages 4B to 9. If you wanted to see the previous pages, please look at the other video presentation. Okay, so now we're going to go back into our Rise. And we're going to continue where we left off. So from your home page, the researcher home page, you'll see here the application that we were working on previously. Let's click on that, and we will continue editing application. So we don't need to go to page 1. We've already completed it. Let's jump to page 4B. All right. So page 4B, 4.2D. This automatically populates based on the previous page, page 4A, the study sites that were listed there. If these are not correct, you'll have to go back to the previous page and then edit the sites. So if it's not correct, you have to edit these sites here or add them in order for it to populate onto the next page. Right, so here we'll click team member affiliation. So if your study team member is a faculty member or a clinician at a certain institute, you do have to click team member affiliation. And then we'll also say we're going to be recruiting at VGH as well as accessing records. Okay, 4.3 here is asking about other applications that were submitted to the REB that is linked to the current application. For instance, if there was a randomized control trial and now you're creating this new application is for the open label phase, then you would write in the details here and list where the initial application is at and also the study number. So the study number, like we said earlier, is here on the top right corner. It starts with an H and then has the year the application was created and then the rest of it. So here you'll enter the number, the study number of the related application and describe the relationship in here in the next box. Okay. And then complete these boxes here. So for 4.23D, it's asking if biospecimens will be collected. And then here is specific for UBC labs. If any of the samples are collected or analyzed at a UBC lab, you will enter a UBC biosafety permit. And this would start with the letter B for beta, and then also have numbers that follow with it. Similar, the same thing if your application will be using radioisotopes and it is UBC, then you'll have a number that starts with R for Ralph and then numbers as well in here. So you enter that here. Is your study a minimal risk? Does it qualify for minimal risk review, or is this a above minimal risk? So this question is very important because it will determine how your application will be reviewed. If it is minimal risk, you would select yes. If it is not minimal risk, then you would select no. So the definition, we will look here in our help bubble and click on here, and then it will bring us to the UBC CREB, Clinical Research Ethics Board. The definition. The definition of minimal risk from the TCPS is essentially if potential participants can reasonably be expected to regard the probability and magnitude of possible harm implied by participation in research to be no greater than those encountered by the participants' everyday life. So if it is just everyday risk, then you could select yes for a minimal risk study. If it is by participating in your research study, your there is an increased risk to the participant, then you would select no. We do have a separate video that does cover the risk, minimal risk versus above minimal risk, if you do want to look at that there as well. And that is under the roadmap to UBC ethics process video. All right, peer review. Here you enter if there's any peer review process ongoing or completed. It is a required field, as you can see here with a red asterisk, so you would enter details there. And then you would type in if there's any details or if there's any internal peer review that occurred. All right, so this 4.6, this question will be changing. This is the old one. But essentially here, we want to know whether or not you have ethics, if you require ethics approval. In particular, this is for University of Saskatchewan or University of Alberta. So I know this one says here about approval about outside of Canadian RUBs, but we are hoping to change this text slightly in 2021 just to make it clear. So for here, because the study does not involve U of Alberta or Saskatchewan, we will click no. And then continue on to the next page. Right, so is this a creation of a registry? So for here, this presentation, we won't go through the registry. It is hoped that we can create a registry application later on, and then let's try to continue. All right, so here we continued without completing a required field, so it does, RISE does flag you and say, okay, you do need to complete it. And then we'll say it does not create, it will not be a registry. Then RISE will now ask you other questions based on this. So is this an application for the research requiring access to clinical charts or data or from registries or databases? We'll say yes, and then you enter the date range. All right, so we do like to have the date, specific date on here as well, just so that it is very clear which set of data. Is this study exclusively a retrospective chart review where the only source of data will be medical charts, records that are currently in existence, and then, so i.e. predate the date of your initial ethics approval. So this is very important. If you are doing a retrospective chart review, the definition for us is it needs to predate the initial ethics approval. So even let's say you're going to be pulling the charts from later on in 2 months later, it really bases on the cutoff time is when you get the approval. All the data from that and previous to that would be considered retrospective, but all the charts that are dated after that will not be considered retrospective. For here, we will not do the retrospective chart review, so we will say no. Hopefully we could also create a separate video for retrospective chart reviews. All right, so we continue on, and it will bring us to page 5. So page 5 is really where all the study protocol and procedures, the study procedures is populated. Here, this is just a brief summary. It is a lay language. We're asking for a lay language, and it is brief and short. Because our review process is not, our reviewers are not all scientific reviewers. We do have individuals from the lay, from the community that review applications as well. So this purpose here is really just to have a short, brief lay summary of the study. And then here, so summarize the research protocol proposal, so purpose, hypothesis, justification, objectives, research design, and statistical analysis. The best method I would say for this would really be like a journal abstract. So to sort of summarize it and list it like how you would see in a journal abstract. A summary and then enter text. Okay. Here, the inclusion criteria, you need to select what the inclusion criteria, including the age criteria, and enter that here. So these are items that you would find in the protocol, and exclusion criteria as well. Recruitment method. So here, I would say to try to focus on this box, mostly because recruitment details and methodologies might not typically be in a protocol, and the REBs do tend to look at this very carefully because it is the initial point of contact, and we want to make sure that there is no undue influence in the recruitment methods and how you're approaching participants. So please do answer all of these sub questions as well, and to attach any initial letter of contact or recruitment materials, posters, phone or email scripts to page 9. So page 9 is our document page where you can upload all these documents. So definitely spend a moment here in this box to outline and detail how are the recruitment methodologies. And then here, if your recruitment is different for control participants, then you could describe it here as well. Okay, so does your research focus on Indigenous peoples, communities, or organizations? And if you click yes, then they'll have other specific sub-questions that are specific for research on Indigenous individuals. And you would complete that. But if you click no, then these questions will disappear. So the use of records, will you be using records to identify potential participants? You complete. And then here, 5.7 is the research procedures. So here, it is very important to have it again outlined out what will happen in the research in terms of the research. So you would outline the research process, and if your study is also with patients, we also like to ask, okay, well, please address what is incremental to the standard of care. So what else beyond, in addition to standard of care, what are the study procedures that would happen in this study? Page 6. What is the time that a participant will need to dedicate for the research? So again, if you're involving patients, to make sure that you separate what is part of standard of care and what is research. So let's say if MRI scan is part of standard of care, then you wouldn't need to add that here. However, questionnaires, the research questionnaires, are the additional and research purposes are conducted for research purposes, then you would list it here. So you would say visit 1 is 2 hours and visit 2 equals 1 hour. And again, it does have a breakdown if you do have different participant groups and if they're different. For instance, let's say you have patients and you have caregivers, and caregivers have slightly less, then you could also enter it here. All right, harms and risks. This is also very important because we do also want to see in terms of, is your study procedure going to require full board review, above minimal risk, or minimal risk? So it is important that you do list all the harms here. Do not put not applicable, because this is not something that would be accepted. You do need to complete this, and you do need to enter what it is, and even for questionnaires, let's say. Right, and potential benefits. This is if there is any benefits. For instance, let's say there will be additional participants will receive let's say a report on their physical assessments. It really is dependent on the research study. And of course, you can't, let's say, promise the world, right? This is a research study, so it really is exploring certain research questions. So the benefits are typically not known. Okay, reimbursements or remunerations. So here you would outline what exactly are the costs and whether or not they'll be reimbursed. We do typically ask if, for instance, a participant is going to be dedicating a lot of time to your research study, why there wouldn't be any reimbursements or remunerations, and also whether or not parking will be reimbursed or if receipts are required. Okay. Okay, obtaining consent. So here is another box where this may not be outlined in the protocol, but we would like the researchers to fully flesh out the details in terms of obtaining consent. So this is very much linked to the previous box, which is box 5.4 in terms of recruitment, right? So outline how they will happen, who will be contacting participants, and just to explain how consent will be obtained. Waiver consent, it really depends on the type of study. We do have separate waiver criteria, which you can find here. So retrospective, like we said earlier, pre-existing, so data collection, then it is this box here. And retrospective biospecimen, and you would have the list here. So once you click on it, it will bring you to the TCPS, and here is the criteria here, the A to F, right? And prospective data collection, then it is here. So based on what type of study it is, when they fit under these three categories, then you would respond to the certain criteria that's listed on the TCPS website. And waiver of consent in emergencies, this is very specific, and it is requirement individuals in medical emergencies only. Typically, we don't really see that many research studies that fall under this category. Most of them do fall under the first category, 6.7a. And again, there is here the list here. Okay? And you would have to address it in these boxes. Time to consent. So there is no minimum time to consent requirement in terms of specific time. But we do say that you need to provide sufficient time for the participant to consider the research, so it won't be so that they wouldn't feel undue influence to agree to a certain study. Our guideline typically is if it is above minimal risk. A typical guideline we like to say is 24 hours. Again, that would be for above minimal risk study. And for minimal study, we say sufficient time for the participant to consider it. So if it is just a questionnaire, and if it is, let's say, an interview, a minimal risk study, then they could have, if it is sufficient, an hour or two, or it really would depend. There is no specific minimum hours that we would say. It is really a matter of providing the participant sufficient time and not having undue influence on the participant. So capacity to consent. So this is really depending on the study population that you have. If you have children, if you're recruiting children, then if they're young children, then it would be they will not have fully capacity to consent. So let's say if you're going to be recruiting 10-year-olds, then they would not have capacity to consent, right? And then once you hit no, then you'll have specific questions regarding the consent. But for here, we will say yes. So consent can be also the age range, right? Who you're going to be consenting. Also, it could be individuals that don't have physical capacity consent, such as those that are unconscious, those that are patients that are in the ICU, right? And if it is in those cases, you obtain consent via alternate methods. So, or another scenario would be individuals with a mental incapacity, such as individuals with dementia, then they would not have capacity consent. So here we'll say yes, and then it'll say, ask you questions about ongoing consent, how is it maintained, and provisions for consent is, will you have translators or braille. Restrictions on disclosure, again, this is pretty straightforward. If there's any restrictions on disclosures of information. Communications of study or results. So research participants dedicate their time for research participation. We do like to strongly recommend that there is plans to send the participants the study results. So this is sort of where you would outline what are the plans for that. Page 7 here. So is this research being conducted at any other sites than those selected on page 4? And we will say yes, and we would just say McGill University. Is this submitted for ethical approval to any other ethics board not covered by this, and say yes. And again, we'll just say McGill REB, and we could enter the contact number. And email. How many participants will be enrolled worldwide? Let's just say 15. And how many enrolled covered under this ethics approval, and then you would pick 25. So let's just say possible breakdown. Again, if you're able to, you could enter this. How many controls, 0, and enter any additional comments. So we'll say 25 caregivers and 25 patients. Okay, drug approval. So enter the generic name of any investigational drugs not yet approved or any marketed drugs outside of its approved indication. So this is very specific to your research project. If you're going to be administering drugs as part of the research study, then you would enter it here if these are investigational drugs. Right? And then here, if these are marketed drugs within its approved indications, then you would enter it here in this section here. If you do not, you would not need to outline any any drugs that are administered as part of standard of care. So let's say you're doing questionnaires on patients with the cancer treatment, a specific cancer treatment, unless that is part of your research study, you would not need to have this entered here. Okay, natural health products, will you be administering any natural health products such as vitamins or supplements, then you enter it here. Experimental devices, any new investigative devices or marketed devices, again, you would list that out here. PERs is the positron emitting radiopharmaceuticals, then you enter here. So page 7 does potentially have a lot of boxes that may not be applicable for you, and in particular for studies that are minimal risk, a lot of these are not applicable. So how we would like to deal with this is usually you would just put in not applicable, just so that we were sure that these boxes were not missed. And you could enter not applicable. Is this a study, a clinical trial, or a drug, device, or natural health product requiring Health Canada regulatory approval? You would say no. And again, because it's not related here, it does say skip to box 710, so we'll skip there. Is this fall under, is this for stem cell? You would say no. Registration of trials. So if it is indeed a randomized controlled trial or randomized, then we do ask that it is registered. So here, any research project that prospectively assigns people or groups of people to an intervention with or without concurrent comparison of control groups to study the side effects relationship between health-related interventions and health outcomes. Right, so we do have one here, and the registration process is a separate process. Usually it is on clinicaltrials.gov. We do have a specific UBZ representative that does help with the registration of the clinical trial. Okay, is this a U.S. regulatory? Is there a requirement to comply with U.S. regulations? No. And does this fall under? No. And then this is box here is related to the U.S. regulations. Again, you could click no if it does not apply to your specific study. Page 8, again, these ones are typically in for clinical trials. So if yours is not a double-blind study, you could just press not applicable. Again, this is again for clinical trials. If you do have any interim analysis, because it does ask for that, you could also enter that in here as well. Study stoppage. So this is circumstances in which the entire study could be stopped. Again, it is very much geared towards clinical trials, but if you have a study, you could also enter it here. Personal identifiers. So how the identity of participants will be protected both during and after the research study. So how are they identified on data collection forms, biospecimen labels, photos, videos, scans, etc. So what we like to see here is that it is a unique study ID will be assigned, and it will not be related to any personal identifiers such as date of birth or SIN. Date of birth, let's say initials or SIN. So it is important that we do see that it is not related to any personal identifiers. Unfortunately, we have seen this submitted before. So for this particular box, please do enter that it is a unique study identifier, not related to a personal identifier. Will they be used as part of the data set? We'll say no. And data access and storage, again, you complete this as it is. Just enter text here. Okay, so current list of names. So make sure that any individual who has access to the data or who will be in contact with participants should be listed on your page 1 application. And describe how data will be stored. Again, here it already has sort of what you need to say. So please confirm any digital data will be stored on an encrypted password protected storage device or hospital network. So you could just a matter of confirming, right? Digital data will be stored on an encrypted password protected computer on the BCH hospital network server. Describe the safeguards in place. So security data, we'd say usually hard copies will be in locked cabinets. And this is files will be stored. Files stored on encrypted server. Right. If data is kept on the web, disposition of data and biospecimens. So box 8.6 is about data in itself, and UBC requirements is that data will be stored for a minimum of 5 years after it has been published or presented. So this is a minimum that UBC imposes. If you have if it is a Health Canada regulated study, then it is a little bit different. It usually does increase, and if it is a drug trial, it is 25 years. But for a majority of studies, it is just the UBC requirement, which is the minimum of 5 years. So biospecimens here, you would talk about if you have collected any biospecimens, please do ensure that you do indicate the disposition, and there are sub-questions along here as well. Will any data or biospecimens be transferred outside of BC? So let's just say yes, because it was McGill. Data will be transferred to McGill via FTP, right? And Dr. Okay, so we do complete it here, and then any biospecimens, say no data linkage is as well. If there is, again, we have a subset of questions to complete. All right, so as you go along, there are specific commands here. You could save it and come back to it later, or you could continue. RISE does automatically save the data. So page 9, here is where you attach all your documents that are related to the study. Rule of thumb is anything that will collect data or that will be seen by the participants should be submitted for ethics review. Now, page 9 is very particular. I need to emphasize that you must click Save, because this page is a little bit finicky. Sometimes it doesn't save it properly, and you can submit it and the REB will not have the most up-to-date document. So a protocol is required for a clinical research ethics board. You must have a protocol, and when you click on Add, it will ask you to put in the title names. Version number is not a requirement unless it is a standardized assessment that already has version numbers. So any documents that you create yourself as a research team do not have to have a version number. What's most important is the version date. So we'll just put today's, we'll just put a day, let's say, and we'll enter it here, and then we'll browse the file. Let's just don't have anything. And just put in. Okay. All right. You could enter a password as well. If it is something that is, this is typically only seen for industry related protocols. So we'll click it and then we go OK, and it will attach. Okay, so, and then if there's any Health Canada regulatory approvals, you would click and add it here. FDA and INDs entered here. Again, these are for regulated studies only. Consent forms. So the consent form is if you will be consenting participants and it will have a consent form, you would have to attach that here. So our forms are located here. We do have a minimal risk consent template. Just for this purposes here, I'm just going to attach it to add the consent document. Okay, so we can also check it here. All right, and make sure. All right, so here the version date is actually February 15th, so make sure it does match it. Otherwise, you will get a proviso from the Research Ethics Board. This is because it will appear on the ethics certificate. So it does need to match. All right, so here, and then assent forms, if you have individuals that do not have capacity but can assent, then you would attach them here. Again, this is available on our website for forms and templates. We have two different kinds. We have the adolescent assent form, which can also be used for adults with a diminished mental capacity, and the assent form, which is for the younger children that are approximately from ages 7 to 13. Okay, so investigator brochures or product monographs. So just a note that this is very specific for the drug trials. This is not your recruitment poster. These are very specific documents that are attached to drugs. So if you do not have that and that's not a part of your study, then do not attach it here. Advertisements. Here is where you would put your posters and whatnot, and then your questionnaires here, and any letters of initial contacts, and other data collection forms or other documents. So you would attach that here. So again, remember to press save. Okay, then we will continue on to the next page. It'll ask you fee for service. So these are for industry or for profit sponsors, such as pharmaceutical companies, or let's say a certain company is sponsoring the study, then it may be subject to a review fee. So here it will just say not applicable because it's not an industry-sponsored study. Page 11. So page 11 is very specific to the sites that you have listed in the page 4s, right? So study sites, which was listed here, and here and here. Right? So Children's and Women's was one of the sites, so you'll have a specific page 11 for Children's and Women's, and then you will need to complete this. We'll just select one here, just say yes, let's just say not applicable, and then we will continue, and then you will get another page 11, and this is for the Vancouver Coastal Health, and you would need to complete this as well. Okay, and then you press continue, and then it'll ask you here. So you have reached the end of the human ethics, and submit the application. So only the PI can submit this, and then click the continue button and submit, or work on this application later. So you could click on continue and it will still be a working document. So let's just submit this because this is a demo. So okay, let's continue. All right, so here you'll have only the PI will have this button. So any new application or any new post-approval activity must be submitted by the principal investigator. So submit application, and then RISE will check if there's any errors in your application, and everything was fine, and it'll ask you to select where, and it even highlights saying that it's going to the Clinical Research Ethics Board. Do you agree with this decision? And it will say yes. So this again is linked to the PI's profile, depending on where they have listed their department heads or departments from, then it will select. So you can select a different one for sign off essentially. So, and it'll ask you to abide by and the declaration, and if you're not ready, again you can click cancel, but in this case we can. Just to let you see here, the current state is pre-submission, but if we click OK, the state will change to it. So, and not only that, but pre-submission, it'll move to department review. All right, so this is a conclusion of our part 2, and now this particular study is off to the screening. So the research ethics board is screening it. So if we go back to the home page, it will not appear on your working documents, but it will appear here, right? All right, thank you for watching.